I'm David Lombardo, and this is WCNY's The Capitol Press Room. We're turning our attention to a recent report from the Rockefeller Institute of Government, which examined the state of the thousands of dams in New York, and we're joined in the studio by two of the report's authors. Laura Rabinow, the organization's Director of Research. Thanks for making the time, Laura.
Thank you.
And also in the studio is Mathilda Scott, a policy analyst with the Institute. Welcome to the show, Mathilda.
Thank you for having us.
Well, then, I want to start with this idea that people might have in their mind's eye about dams, which probably ranges from the Hoover Dam to a beaver dam. So, for starters, can you walk us through the variety of dams that litter the Empire State, including the number, the age, and I guess the sizes that are out there?
Sure. So we have about 6,000 dams in New York State. That's what we have recorded. There are likely a number of other dams out there that researchers are still working to catalog and identify, but we have about 6,000 in our records now. The average age of those dams is about 87 years old, and that's about 20 years older than the national average. It's important when we talk about our aging infrastructure. And they're about an average of 15 feet high or so. So you might be imagining something like the Hoover Dam, like you spoke about. These are typically, though not all, much smaller dams that we're dealing with in New York State.
Did you get a sense when taking in this landscape of how all these dams ended up popping up? Or, I mean, was there a big dam period in New York history? Was this something that has just gradually occurred? Where did this landscape, or how did this landscape take shape?
We have dams dating back to the 1600s still in New York. New York is an older state, it is earlier industrialized state, along with a lot of Northeast states and some other states as well. And so these states tend to just have older dam infrastructure. They might have been used as sawmills or grist mills. When we're talking about smaller dams, you see that over time, particularly like late 18 to early 1900s, really shift to larger dams. And then we're talking about the bigger dam area as we move into the 1930s to 60s, mostly across the South and Southwestern United States. But that history also impacts some of New York as well.
Yes, and I think, as Laura was saying, a lot of these were kind of products of their time. So we also researched some dams that were used for ice making and other things that we don't really think about right now as prominent industries, and whose purpose is not really used so much anymore.
Well, what's the significance of the status quo? For example, Laura mentioned that we have older dams. So are there reasons to be concerned from a safety perspective about the dams, or just from a functionality perspective?
Yeah, the older aging infrastructure, as it's referred to generally.
Way to be polite to the dams.
I know. I'm really concerned about their feelings here. It has a concern in as far as, are we maintaining it, right? And if we're maintaining it, okay. And if we're not maintaining it, then there might be cause for concern depending on whether or not it is deemed a high hazard dam. But there are those two classifications. So one is about if it fails, right? How high a level of concern should we have about what's going to happen afterward? And the other is about its actual condition, right? Our condition assessment. And that is about, is it in good shape or not right now as we look at it? We don't have as much up-to-date information as we might like about the present condition of a lot of dams in New York, but New York State, in terms of its policy and regulatory structures, have over the last few decades tried to address that more and more so that we have more up-to-date evaluations, particularly for intermediate and high-hazard dams on the record to reference, and that we have emergency plans in case they do fail.
Absolutely. And to go off of Laura's point for the purpose of these dams, there are still many dams that are being used today for water storage, for recreation, that are in use. But then there are many of those smaller dams that are no longer really serving a purpose. And that may be an opportunity for dam removal and to reconnect that river restoration and reconnection.
Ultimately, who has the responsibility of making decisions about dams, like ensuring their safety or whether they should exist at all? Is this a state-level oversight entity, for example?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so New York regulates many dams in New York, most of the dams that are in New York, though there are also federal regulations that exist for certain dams. But owners primarily have the responsibility for maintaining their dams and deciding what happens if they are going to decommission or remove them.
And when you talk about owners, does that mean John and Jane Q. Public might actually own some of these thousands of dams in the Empire State?
Sometimes, actually.
We spoke to two dam owners. One was a homeowner who inherited a home that just happened to have a dam from her mom. And this dam was really in bad shape, kind of falling apart. And she learned it was basically her responsibility to make these decisions. And this is quite an overwhelming kind of process to go through when you're not an engineer or someone who knows anything about dams.
Or any beaver DNA, for example.
Yes. And then a second dam owner we spoke to in her professional capacity through an organization she ran at this building, just happened to have a dam on property as well. And she found herself really delving in and trying to become the decision maker for this structure without any experience. So I think our report suggests that nationwide, about 65% of dams in the United States are owned by private owners. So I don't know if we have the exact number for private ownership in New York State, but it is much higher than most people would expect, I think.
Well, you may not have a dam that just all of a sudden appears in your backyard, right? Yeah, there's no worry of that. There are a number of owners who just may not be in the same kind of position as we imagine, like a larger private entity or the state might be in order to navigate, no pun intended, these processes of dam removal or modification and decision making about that. For many of the folks that we spoke to, it became a second job, really. Mm-hmm. And when you're dealing with somebody like Mathilda was just speaking about who was running a nonprofit, right? The bandwidth is really small. And being able to better utilize resources to support folks in that decision-making process may enable us to move towards further ecological restoration, ultimately.
Your report notes that there are states out there with dedicated teams of agency staff working on dam issues such as dam removal, and one of those is our neighbor, Massachusetts. How does that approach and experience and their outcomes compare to what's going on in New York?
Yep, we found in the experience of the folks that we spoke to, so tons of different stakeholders from all different perspectives of this process, that was a tremendous aid in ensuring that there was further ecological restoration, connectivity, and that dam removals were ultimately successful and moved through. New York has 6,000, I said earlier, dams. Massachusetts around 3,000, but they have moved much more quickly to remove dams than we have over the last several years as a consequence of investing in their staff. I believe we've had about between 7 and 9 full-time staff over the last several years. They have about 25 comparatively.
And with a fraction of the dams.
Well, half, yeah. That fraction.
You nailed it. So, given the unique landscape in New York with a variety of dams, I imagine there's not a one-size-fits-all approach to either the maintenance or deciding when to remove them. So what are the different options that are out there for policymakers and local dam owners? And how do you determine what's right in each situation?
That's a great, complicated question.
You've got 4 minutes, Mathilda.
And I think it really kind of depends on where you come from on this issue, right? So every community really needs to decide what's the best for their community, right? Some communities use their dam and use the waterway that it creates for recreation, and it's important for property values and economic development reasons. So we are by no means advocating that all dams should be removed everywhere. Obviously, some dams are used for water storage for New York City. But then there are other dams, right, that are potentially already falling apart and potentially not in use anymore. And people don't even really realize that it could be removed or that there are ecological benefits with removal that could impact the whole river's health, you know? So I think these decisions are very complicated. These processes take a really long time. I think on average, we've been looking at like a 5-year timeline people go through to remove a dam. So it's a long process. But I think people who make those decisions for removal, we talked to quite a few experts in river health. The research has suggested that this is one of the most beneficial things we could do, especially for these low-hanging fruit dams that are no longer in use, smaller scale, maybe already falling apart, right? We have a lot of opportunities to remove those.
I'll also note we've put in since 2022 a significant amount of money in New York State, not towards dam removal specifically, but towards a number of issues related to water and healthy ecosystems that pertain to and include dams and their removal or modification. I believe it's about $650 million is the umbrella amount under the Environmental Bond Act that was put towards this. And there have been hundreds of millions, I think, rolled out already under that. That said, right, there are these 6,000 dams within New York, and thinking about how do we focus some of that money, how do we best utilize it is really important. Massachusetts, you brought up earlier, has been really effective at this, or more effective than we have been at doing this more quickly. And part of that is the staff, as we said. They also did a study on some of their dams that they removed, right? And they found that over the course of a 30-year period, removing them saved them about 60% of what it would have cost them to maintain it, right? So there are not just ecological benefits, but financial benefits to removal over the long run. And that's particularly, I think, true when it comes to smaller dams because the cost of removing them is so much lower. And there's a USGS report, I believe from 2023 or thereabouts, that looked at the cost of removal across different sizes of dams. I believe that the cost is literally an order of magnitude when you look at the small compared to the large size dams. And so it's just potentially much more cost effective for us to focus our efforts there.
Does it make sense to have either a state government entity or some sort of statewide association or nonprofit overseeing what we're doing with these dams in the future so that there is some sort of coordinated or holistic approach to this? Because while, as we've talked about, these are unique situations, they could have ramifications downstream, so to speak, or regionally. So is there a entity that makes sense for coming up with, say, a master plan and implementing it? Does such a body already exist, for example?
So those full-time staff members that I mentioned earlier are within DEC. They're not necessarily in a concentrated office, right? And so they're spread out and they may not themselves be full-time on this particular issue. So they may do a number of other tasks. This is one part of their role, perhaps in a regional office somewhere. And by and large, everybody we spoke to, including dam owners, spoke incredibly highly of all of the staff that they worked with and found them incredibly helpful. But because we haven't actually done a lot of dam removals in New York, there's not a lot of experience to draw on. And so there are a few people with a good amount of experience, but that experience isn't necessarily shared very broadly or deeply. And so building a more focused staff around this can help build that experience as we conduct more removals or modifications. I think that was one of the challenges that folks found was just connecting in the first place to the right resources and staff. And then once they did, for those staff members themselves, really being able to draw on a well of knowledge of people who have gone through this process many times, right? And so we haven't flexed that muscle a lot yet here in New York.
And to kind of build off that, I think another thing that came up throughout our interviews with dam owners and others involved in this space is the role of nonprofits. We see really passionate kind of people who are involved in this in the nonprofit realm, and they oftentimes act as a project manager, identifying potential projects, getting people connected, helping dam owners start this process. So they're really a vital force in these efforts right now.
What about good data? Is this an issue? Because you mentioned maybe not having the best or clearest picture of the conditions and even the total number. You can get it different from different sources. So is that something that you're working on or concerned about?
Yes, very much. I think that if you look at the national level data, right, there are about 92,000+ dams in the national inventory. That inventory only includes 1,900 listed for New York State. In our own inventory in New York, we have 6,000. That's a huge discrepancy, right, in terms of whether or not we can effectively compare what we're doing to other states, right? And having good comparative data is really important to understanding what effective policy is at the end of the day. In our own data, right, then there are these much smaller dams that we still don't have completely identified. And so that's another challenge when we're talking about trying to address this low-hanging fruit within our own state.
And to kind of go off that too, not directly with just knowing where the dams are throughout the state, but there's also quite a few dams that we don't really know the condition of. Mm-hmm. So nationally, we know that there are 58,000 that are unrated. So we don't really know their hazard or their condition. So there's just a lot of missing information to make these decisions based off of. And I think people who are involved in this space really care about this data and are trying to kind of make these efforts work, but it is just a huge task with so many small dams that are unmapped and unknown amount right now. Mm-hmm.
I imagine there are some dams where there is a real sense of attachment amongst the people who live there, or maybe people who like to visit the area, either because it's scenic or maybe it provides some sort of recreational uses. In those situations, what sort of buy-in do you expect from the local community, and how do you keep them engaged in a meaningful way? Or is that maybe not even a concern?
I think that's a huge concern for the stakeholders that we spoke to. We spoke to them about community engagement, and that was one of the things that they often struggled with going through this process, and that they acknowledged should be a real priority whenever they were moving through this process. I'll just speak anecdotally because I'm from Troy originally, and so we went through the Mount Ida Dam process some years ago, right? And I lived at the time downstream of that dam. I had friends who lived upstream of that dam and even on the little reservoir that it created, and they moved there, right? Particularly because they had that water body in front of them and really appreciated that. And I imagine their home value increased as part of that too. So I think finding processes that bring those downstream and those upstream folks together can be particularly important in our discussions and in my anecdotal experience, right? Having places where those folks are talking to each other about the different values and risks that they're experiencing in a meaningful way is really important.
And another thing that came up when we spoke to these nonprofits was the role of education too. So many people aren't aware of the ecological benefits that dam removal can provide for waterways and river health. So I think really kind of being involved in public outreach and public education and trying to make this expertise available for everyone is really helpful in this process.
Well, in preparing this report, I imagine you became pretty well versed in how policymakers are approaching and thinking about these issues. And I'm curious whether there's any indication to either of you that the status quo is going to be disrupted in any way, shape, or form, that there is going to be additional dollars committed to this, additional personnel, or any sort of taking the bull by the horns, so to speak, in terms of trying to approach this in a more holistic and thoughtful way.
I don't know if we could speak to that. I certainly...
Nobody said to you, hey, we're planning on doing X, Y, and Z in 2027, I imagine.
From a policy standpoint, like a official standpoint, no. But the staff that we talked to have been working on implementing new processes, some of which have started to be talked about, some of which are just starting to roll out or be outlined.
Is this statewide or locally?
At the state level, right? So there are DEC staff who are already taking up some of the things that we had recommended within our report related to processes on sampling,
sediment
testing, and generalized permits that could help the process move forward more expediently in cases where there is low risk. And they're already doing that work. I don't know, though I'd also be interested to hear if there are other officials or policymakers who are interested in this topic. There is state money available, but how we use it can always be improved. So it's important to think about that. And I think, if we want to focus on ecological restoration as a whole while addressing some of these existing risks, there are ways we can do that, and that we can do that pretty cost effectively too.
Well, unfortunately, that's all the time we have for this conversation. We've been speaking with Laura Rabinow. She is the Director of Research for the Rockefeller Institute of Government. Thanks as always, Laura.
Thank you.
And we've also been hearing from Mathilda Scott, a policy analyst with the Institute. Thank you so much, Mathilda.
Thank you.
Support for the Capitol Press Room comes from O'Donnell and Associates, a public affairs firm providing strategic guidance to businesses and nonprofits on navigating policy and regulatory issues. More information is available at o'donnellsolutions.com.